So excited that you have joined me for today's Bible study called Pushing Past Your Past. Today we're talking about shattered legacies, and we're going to be digging in to just a few scriptures found in John chapter 5, starting with verse 6. I wonder what kind of legacy you were given. When I look at mine, I find like an old tattered piece of luggage. It was just handed down from generation to generation. And there's good things in here, but there were also things like alcoholism that ranges back in my family tree, still continues in my family tree in other ways. I find in here rage. I find in here abandonment, the inability to handle conflict. And there came a time when I held my own daughter in my arms, and I thought, it stops here. So today I want to take a look at these scriptures and some spiritual and scriptural truths to help us create maybe a new branch of our family tree, to put those shattered legacies behind us so that we can give ourselves, our relationships with those that we love, something much, much better. It's interesting when we look in these scriptures in John chapter 5, we find Jesus approaching a pool called Bethesda. Now, this pool was rumored to be a pool of healing. And so people came from everywhere to sit around this pool, and they believed that basically that the waters were stirred from time to time. And when that happened, people would clamor to jump into this pool or to ease into this pool and hopefully to find healing. And Jesus saw a man who was lying on a mat, and it says he had been ill for 38 years. 38 years. And we don't know if he'd been lying beside the pool for 38 years, but we do know that it had been a very long time. Now, Jesus asked this man a really interesting question. He came to him and he knelt to speak to him, and he said, "Do you want to get well?" Now, that seems almost like an insensitive question, doesn't it? Of course he wants to get well. And yet, it's interesting also to see the man's response, because I think that if anyone came to you or I and said, "You've been ill for a long time, emotionally ill, spiritually ill, physically ill, do you want to get well?" and it was Christ himself, I think we would be jumping up and down and saying, "Yes, yes, I want to be well." But he didn't do that. In fact, the man came back and said this. He said, "I can't. No one will put me in the water. Everyone gets in front of me when the water is stirred." And so today I want to look and ask that same question as we begin this process is, do we really want to get well? And if you do, I think that there's three very strong truths that we can find in this to help us answer, yes, we do. Because Jesus said to this man in John 5:8, he said to the man, "I want you to stand, pick up your mat, and walk." Stand. What does it feel like to stand when you've been lying down for 38 years? I imagine it's painful. I imagine that his bones and his joints ached. I imagine as he tried to stand, his body did not feel as he thought it should. And yet, it was the first step toward walking, to stand. When I look at the patterns of my past, at my legacy, honestly, it's easier for me to stay down and to look at that person and say, I am the way I am because of what he did or what she did. I am the way that I am because of my past. Basically saying the same thing as the man lying at the pool. I can't. Don't you see? I can't because of her, because of this. And yet, what I think is a more healthy response is to say, yes, I want to be healed, whatever it takes. And so we go back into the past and we begin to look at this legacy and to see not what someone did to us, but to look at what we are still carrying in our relationships and in ourselves today. I want to give you an example. In my family, if conflict happens, as far back as you can see, the women in our family, we run, baby, run. We don't like to deal with conflict. And so for my grandmother, she would abandon her family for up to 2 weeks at a time when conflict happened, when it became overwhelming. And that made my mom and her siblings feel unsafe and unstable. When I was growing up, my beautiful mom, who was screaming for help and no one was listening, whenever conflict happened, and as a mother of 5 children, conflict happened, she would threaten suicide. She would abandon the scene. She would fly into rages. And that was her way of avoiding conflict. It was just too much. And a threat of suicide is the ultimate form of abandonment. And it made us feel unsafe and unstable. And so by the time that I became a mom and I held my child in the arm for the first times, I thought, you know, these are not the things that I'm going to do, so I'm okay. And yet, when I look in my legacy and I see that the women in my family tree struggle with dealing with conflict, I had to see that in my own life that was an issue. No, I wasn't going to threaten suicide. No, I wasn't going to take off. But what I did, my form, is when conflict happened, I just brushed it under the rug and hoped it went away. And see, what I didn't realize is that in normal families, conflict happens. In normal relationships, conflict happens. It's not that conflict is bad, but that there is a healthier response to deal with conflict. And so for me, going back to the past, not as a victim, but as a scholar, helped me to stand. The second thing that Jesus said to this man was, pick up your mat. Now, that mat had to be grungy because he had been lying on it for all of these years without leaving, without moving. It was conformed to the lines of his body. It felt comfortable. And to be honest with you, it protected him from the elements. It was his only protection. And so what is our mats? What are the things that we have held on to from the past or held on to? That might be anger or unforgiveness. That might be building a wall around ourselves. And to be honest with you, that was my mat. You see, I built a wall around myself that was really very pleasing to the eye. I could be very polite to you, but I did not let you in. And so the reasoning behind that, my mat, my wall, was that as long as I was in that wall, no one could hurt me. I was perfectly safe, but I was also perfectly alone. I was also perfectly stuck. And so when Jesus looks at us and says, put down your mat, you know, it may be that your parent was an addict or an alcoholic, and yet alcohol makes you feel better. And Jesus is looking at you and saying, you know, it was their mat and it is now your mat. Are you willing to put it down? Looking at my wall, Suzie, are you willing to invite me in with a sledgehammer to break this wall down so that you can walk, so that you can go forward? The question that I often hear whenever we talk about breaking down walls or putting down those things that are so familiar to us, even if they're unhealthy, is, oh, Suze, do you know the risk that you're asking me to take? I have to be vulnerable. What if I get hurt? And I think totally that's the wrong question. I think the question is not what if I get hurt, but it is what if I discover things about myself that only God knew was inside of me? What if I climb out of that wall, or I put down that mat and I begin to stand and I begin to take steps forward and I discover all of the things that God intended for me to discover? What if I discover that there are people who are works in progress and that maybe out of their own pain or out of their own whatever, that they might try to hurt another person? But what if I learn that I can't change them, but I also can't let them keep me from moving forward and from growing as a person? The third thing that Jesus said to this man was to walk, to take steps forward. How scary is that if you haven't walked in 38 years? What if I fall? What if I stumble? What if I go in the wrong direction? Well, I have to tell you that this is the most powerful truth of all, is that you're not alone, that he walks with you. What I had to do at this point to walk was to say, I now have an empty suitcase. It's just got old yuck stuff in it, Father, that you've asked me to throw out. What now? See, this legacy, this tattered legacy, was no longer mine to give. It was trying to grow a new branch of the family tree, and God gave me a new legacy, and it's not perfect, but I began to grow and I began to learn. In John chapter 15:2, the scripture talks about the dead wood that we have, and how that God comes in and he begins to prune that dead wood away. Why? So that we can have new growth, so that we can learn new things, so that we can see ourselves in the way that God sees us, to see our lives not through the mirror of the past, but to take a fresh look at what is around us today, and to see ourselves not as a little girl or a little boy in the past, but to see ourselves as the strong, confident people that we are today, to see the gifts that we have in our life today. Now, will this happen overnight? Transformation rarely happens overnight. There are those instantaneous miracles. And yet I think that what happens is in transformation is it happens over time, and it's no less a miracle. So celebrate every time that you see things in a new way, or that you learn something new. Take that time to celebrate that. Next week we're going to talk about broken mirrors. But for this week, I want you to know that I have added a file in Word that you can download. There's no way that we can take this study as deep as we need to in the short amount of time that we have each week. But I hope that you'll take this document, that you'll print it out, you'll get along with God, and you'll answer these questions about your shattered legacy, what you've received, and what you are asking God to remove so that you can start fresh. I cannot wait to see you next week.